Hello everybody and welcome to today's Music Lit 3, which is about the turn of the 20th century and truly an epoch-making set of changes in the world of all the arts, including music. Listen, the first thing I want to do is give you an overview of where we're going to be this week. What we're talking about is the dawn of a sense of a new era of progress in the musical arts. Today we're going to be in France, La France, in France, and on Thursday, we're going to turn to Vienna quickly and then back to France. But I want you to understand that the developments that we are looking at here in France and the German lands are global developments. They happen in every country all over the world. We just have to focus on France and Germany and Austria because those are the places where our most important works are seated. But this imperative for finding a way of new artistic expression that is free from all of the expectations and limitations, restrictions really, of the previous centuries, the previous millennium, is a global phenomenon that spans all of the arts. So let's get started. Looking at France, the first thing I need to make you aware of is that this leadership that France assumes at the turn of the 20th century is born of a crisis of faith and national identity that erupts in 1870-71. Here's the situation. As you recall, historically, since the 17th century, France has been a single powerful, economically, militarily, culturally powerful force in all of the arts in the world of nations and the community of nations. Whereas Germany, the German lands, were this, until very recently, fractured community of nations that had a common culture and so on, but didn't have any political unity, which meant no military unity and so on, right? So what happens is that at the turn of 1870 to 71, we have an outbreak of territorial dispute between Germany, which is newly unified, and France. Germany was the new kid on the block in terms of the community of nations. No one expected Germany to win this war, which is called the Franco-Prussian War, and instead, Germany utterly trounced France in a matter of weeks, 6 weeks or so, right? And so what happens is that this Franco-Prussian War not only establishes Germany as a military and economic leader in the community of nations in the late 19th century, but also utterly humiliates France, which is the country that everyone expected to win. So the Franco-Prussian War results in the founding in France of a number of new institutions and cultural approaches which were intended to, in a sense, compensate for that political humiliation that resulted from the Franco-Prussian War. One of these was the Société Nationale de Musique, or also known as the Société Nationale de la Musique Française, which is essentially an international society based in France for French language composers and so on, and it essentially sponsors new composers, new compositions, French performers in every genre except opera in the late 19th century. This is an extremely important cultural affirmation of what it means to be French, and that includes the rediscovery of French music that had been subjugated to German music in the late 19th century. And earlier 19th century and so on. Germany had become the dominant cultural figure, especially in the world of music, through Wagner, through Beethoven before him, and so on. French composers said, we do not have to stand for this. French music is great and beautiful. Let's affirm this and let's sponsor the creation of new French musical compositions. Huge amounts of government funding went into the creation of this new French musical society, and that, of course, did what such government leadership always does in the worlds of the arts. It created new discoveries, new imaginations, new ideas, and so on. Among the most important leaders of this Société Nationale de la Musique Française, which were Saint-Saëns, César Franck, and Gabriel Fauré. And one of the most important events that happens another 15 years later is that France, specifically Paris, hosts the Universal Exposition, which became what's called the World's Fair today. Countries from all over the world sent their music, their artists, their inventors, all of these people to Paris for all the world to see, and all the world flocked to Paris to witness these things from all over the world. On the PowerPoint, the Google Slides presentation for today, I actually have a poster from the Société Nationale, rather from the Universal Exposition, and that shows the Eiffel Tower, which was erected for this specific event. And those of you who have been to Paris can look at the landscape around the Eiffel Tower in that poster and see what Paris looked like at this time. So anyway, this is a major set of events: the Franco-Prussian War and the founding of the Société Nationale de la Musique Française, and ultimately the Universal Exposition World's Fair of 1889. So the result of all this is that we do have a rediscovery of what it means to be French in music, a new pride and French national identity in the last years of the 19th century and at the turn of the 20th century. We break this into two broad families in discussing French music of the late 19th century and early 20th century. One of them is a strain that we call academicism, which looks back to France's past and to the world of romantic musical language with subjectivity, organicism, and all of those ideas packed into it. And we call this academicism because it was studied in the conservatories, taught in the conservatories, resulted in many new, beautiful, and powerful musical compositions, and so on. The other branch is called the avant-garde, which literally means the front guard, right? This casts the world of progress in musical composition as literally a military offensive, with the front guard being the people who lead the way. You can see this in my hands that come towards you, marching towards you to illustrate this. That is the avant-garde. The avant-garde was consciously devoted to breaking with the past, to innovation at all costs, to finding a way of saying what is it that establishes who we are and who has defined who we are as a community up until this point. What can we do to carry that further, not by repeating it, but by breaking with it? So general traits of this is that both of these is that they celebrated French art and history, as well as for other French language art and history, even if it was outside the geographic confines of political France. We returned to composers from the distant past and so on, and we decided that all of those things that are characteristic of German-dominated art from the mid-19th century and before, an emphasis on form, on very, very symphonic textures and all of those things, were things that needed to be avoided in French language. The one thing that we needed to do most of all was to avoid sounding German. So French music of the late 19th and early 20th century generally tended towards very clear and transparent textures, very graceful melodies. Think about this: rejection of Wagnerian music. Wagnerian melodies are anything but graceful. Singers hate to sing Wagner because the melodic lines are so awkward, have so many awkward leaps in them, and very transparent textures. This resulted as a kind of middle ground between the academic streak as it was first resulted in the SN or Manifest and the SNMF, and the avant-garde, and that middle ground institution was the founding of the Independent Society of Music, the Société Indépendante de Musique, which was directed by Fauré. Many of you know Gabriel Fauré's music. His songs are frequently done today, and his Requiem is one of the greatest twilight of the 19th century pieces of sacred choral music. So now, where are we? We have gone from the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War into the establishment of a National Society for French Music and an academicist streak which celebrates the beauty of the French musical imagination in its recent and distant past, and also a more modernist streak in the Independent Society of Music. All of those things pave the way to the French avant-garde, which has as its rallying call the imperative of innovation. If something has already been done, these people would say, this is a reason for us not to do it. Let's not take ourselves so seriously. Let's instead say that what we have to do is simply what is authentic to us not to our predecessors, right? So we have a subset that turns out to be neoclassicism, but really there are two groups of French Paris-based composers who lead this avant-garde in France in the early 20th century. One of them is Les Six, the Six, which took Eric Satie, whom we'll look at in just a moment, as their inspiration and leader, and the other group comes to be known as the Apaches, Les Apaches. And these people took Debussy, whom we will also look at in a moment, as their inspiration. And welcome to today's Music Lit Sweepstakes. So listen, you know the rules. Within 24 to 36 hours of when this class was originally supposed to meet, the people who win today's sweepstakes will send me a short email saying, "Hey, Dr. Cooper, I see that I won the sweepstakes. What do you want to know?" Upon receiving that email, I will send you a simple question, and within 24 hours of getting my question, you should respond to me with the answer to that question. Having done that, you will get either an extra attendance quiz grade if you're on the paper track, or a 3-point addition to the final score on your final exam if you're on the test track for the class. So without further ado, who won today's sweepstakes? Well, let me tell you. Today's first winner is Micah. Micah, congratulations. Give yourself a hand. You won today's sweepstakes. And today's second winner is Shelby. Shelby, give yourself a healthy round of applause. You won today's sweepstakes. Now, you guys know what to do. Send me that email. "Hey, Dr. Cooper, I see that I won. What do you want to know?" Then answer my email. All that has to happen within 48 hours. All right. I'll see you guys on the other side for our next episode of Music Lit Sweepstakes, and in the meantime, thanks for playing. Whoa, cool. Look at this. These guys are cleaning the window outside there, and I'm on a giant screen of some sort. Huh. Anyway, okay, so let's look at the avant-garde in the person of Satie and Les Six. First of all, Satie was an ardent French nationalist, but it's worth noting, here, let me adjust this just a little bit so that you can see my shiny skull. He was also a person who was extraordinarily eccentric. In the PowerPoint, I have a link to the slide on Satie, and I encourage you to follow that link so that you can get a taste of how decidedly weird Satie was. He was absolutely brilliant. He did not take himself seriously, except to the point that he needed to emphasize not taking oneself seriously. That was very earnest for him. The work that initiated his style was a set of 3 gymnopédies, one of which the SU Orchestra was going to play this past in this spring's concert, but of course that has been tabled for now in the wake of COVID-19. But one of the things that Satie cultivated in his music was the abandonment of this notion that music needed to be emotional. Think about the music that we have been listening to. It has all been based on the assumption that what we are here for is to be emotional, to be dramatic, to be turbulent, to be triumphant, all of these things. Satie said, no, music is sound. Music should bring pleasure. Music should be beautiful, and so on. So, Satie's music is characterized by a very clear, transparent, here, get out of my way, buddy. Okay, let's do it this way. I'll tell you what, I'll move my chair. There. This is not going the right way. Okay, so I hope you guys are enjoying these little asides. Okay, I'll embrace this. Here we go. So, Satie decides to be clear, transparent, detached, unemotional, but also sometimes beautiful. At the same time, one piece, which I also mention in your slide, is called Dried Embryos, and it's a piece of music that is absolutely sardonic in its wit. It takes about 30 seconds to do a piece of music, which doesn't have much musical content to it, and then another 45 seconds to do a coda, which is all tonic and dominant, back and forth, after the model of Beethoven, but multiplied over many times. It's hilarious. It pokes fun at the whole idea of serious musical composition. Now, this mantra for avant-garde irreverence, detachment, and so on was taken up by the group called Les Six, and I named these composers on your slide. I want you to be aware of the names of four of them: Arthur Honegger, Darius Milhaud, Francis Poulenc, and Germaine Taillefer, who is one of the most underrated but also incredibly, in my opinion, brilliant women composers of the early 20th century. Those four composers of the Six are known very well outside of France today. The other two, Georges Auric and Louis Duret, are composers who are still known and whose music is still performed in France, but who are, oh, there, that's better. Uh, but who are otherwise not very well known. But these are the people who are Satie's inheritors. So take a moment right now and listen to the Satie Gymnopédie that I give you. And okay, now, oh cool, look at this. I'm on a Polaroid. Huh, and who is she? Anyway, okay, so I'm on a Polaroid, and we're here to talk now about the Gallic marvel of the Boulanger Sisters. I would think that maybe this person who is holding the Polaroid camera that I'm being filmed by was one of the Boulanger sisters, except that I'm pretty sure they're both dead right now. Anyway, okay, so there are two of the Boulanger sisters. The one who is best known today is Nadia Boulanger, who is a composer, conductor, pianist, organist, salonier, and teacher. She lived in the US during World War II, but almost everybody who was anybody in the world of United States music in the early 20th century studied with her at some point. She was a veritable site of musical pilgrimage in her own right. The composers who studied with her include Leonard Bernstein, Elliott Carter, whom we'll talk about briefly next week, Aaron Copland, and Virgil Thompson. Her sister, Lili Boulanger, is an even more remarkable composer because she really lived to be only 25 years old. But in that time, she not only won the Prix de Rome, becoming, I think, the first woman to have won that prestigious prize from the Paris Conservatory. She completed a 5-act opera. She wrote a huge number of choral compositions, chamber and orchestral pieces. And again, remember, she only lived to be 25. She did all of this. She preserved the very clear prosody, which is to say the rhythms and accents of the French speech as it's done, but Lili Boulanger experimented with all kinds of new sonorities and scales, including chromatic saturation, the whole tone scale, and the octatonic scale. Now, I want to draw your attention to those musical devices very quickly. Look at them again. Chromatic saturation, the whole tone scale, and the octatonic scale. Chromatic saturation basically means that with any given very short expanse of music, sometimes a measure, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more, we will use all 12 pitches of the chromatic scale. That measure is saturated with the chromatic scale. What this does, what its effect is to undermine the sense of tonality. Remember that the tonality, the whole concept of tonality is geared towards the notion that one pitch in any given piece of music is more important than all others, that the pitches that are related to that by the fifth, above and below, are of secondary importance, and that beyond that, thirds and fourth related pitches are of tertiary importance. So that is a very clear hierarchical approach to the ways that the notes of the 12 note chromatic scale relate to one another. And one of the things that many 20th century composers did, including Lili Boulanger, was to say, who says? I don't believe in that hierarchy. What I want is something in which all notes of the chromatic scale are equal or comparatively equal. One way to achieve that is through chromatic saturation. Now let's return to that concept. The idea is to find ways of getting around conventional tonality. if you think about the most chromatically challenging music that we've seen so far, think about Wagner, Tristan and Isolde, think about Richard Strauss and Hugo Wolf, think about anything that we've listened to. It's all very chromatic, but you always have a very clear sense of what the tonic is, and that clear sense of what the tonic is, the most important note, is reinforced by other pitches by means of triadic harmonies. So if you want to abandon conventional tonality, you've got to find a way around that sense of creating a hierarchy of the pitches of the 12-note chromatic scale. Two of the techniques that Lili Boulanger and some other composers of the early 20th century developed were called the whole tone scale and the octatonic scale. Think about a whole tone scale. There are only two whole tone scales on the 12-note keyboard. One of them starts on C and would be spelled C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, or B flat, back to C, right? Every interval is a whole step. That produces a completely different sound for the scale than we have had. Moreover, here are two other particularly appealing features about the whole tone scale. Number one, there are by definition no half steps, and half steps are always what has been used to pull harmonically towards the most important pitches in the hierarchy of the scale in conventional harmony, right? So if you think about, let's say, a C major scale, the B that pulls towards C is something that always helps you to understand that C is the goal, right? Additionally, the third of C is E, and the half step above that, F, is something that helps you to understand that that E, which makes clear that C is the tonic, or if you want to be in the minor mode, then E flat, that F becomes more important, right? So those half steps have always been extremely important in creating and reinforcing the hierarchy of pitches in conventional tonality. One important step in the direction of throwing out conventional tonality is to throw away the half steps. That's exactly what the whole tone scale does. Now, there are other scales that do that as well. The most obvious of them is the pentatonic scale, which is comprised entirely of whole steps with gaps in them. If you play the black keys on a piano, D flat, E flat, G flat, A flat, B flat, you'll get a sense of this. You can create a sense of one of those pitches, let's say G flat being the most important, kind of a temporary tonic, but it does not use any conventional means of half steps and dissonances to create that. And the other scale that you can use is the octatonic scale. If you think about it, any normal scale, major or minor, normally includes 7 pitches between the initial statement of its tonic and the concluding statement of its tonic. And you might want to think in terms of solfege here, right? And those include those half steps. But those half steps are irregularly placed, and the fact that those half steps are irregularly placed at certain strategic points that pull towards the tonic and its third are the things that help to reinforce the hierarchy. So, what happens if we undermine the conventional sense of tonality by having a scale that has 8 rather than 7 pitches between the initial statement of the tonic and its follow-up? One way that we can do this, the most common form of octatonic scale, is to have regularly alternating series of half and whole steps. So listen to this scale and go to a keyboard or pick up your instrument or just sing through this right now. C, D flat, E flat, E natural, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C. That's a regular alternation of half and whole steps, and it produces a set of 8 pitches between the two C's in that particular scale. Any triad that you make in there will defy the conventional sound of triads as they relate to other triads within a piece of music. And let's take that notion of the triad back to the whole tone scale. In the whole tone scale, again, all whole steps, right? Every whole step has its own triad, or can have its own triad based on it, but listen to the sound of that triad. C, E, G sharp, D, D, F sharp, A sharp, right? So every sonority is augmented. augmented triads are the ones that have no sense of tonal direction or gravity because all the intervals are the same size at all times. So this is another example of how we can take and rethink the materials of music, the musical elements, in order to come up with a completely new approach to not only melody, not only harmony, but also the form of a piece of music. Because as we have seen, composers think of music in terms of its tonal. Let's turn from there to musical impressionism. Remember that what we're thinking about here is rethinking the whole notion of what musical expression is about. And traditionally, music has strived to be fairly representational in its content. It can be either completely abstract, but it does so using forms that are representational and based on very clear structures surrounding tonic and dominant and so on, or it can be programmatic and try to have very clear outlines that celebrate some obviously objective and more or less stable subject. In the visual arts, in the late 19th century, a painter named Claude Monet, who coincidentally later went blind, but thinking of a counterpart to Beethoven's deafness not that long ago in this course, came up with this piece of music, or rather a painting called an impression of sunrise. And that impression is on your slide in the PowerPoint. If you look at this, you see several things. The most important of them is that there are no clear lines. Yes, you can get the sense of what the lines are. For one thing, you can see the river, which in this case is the Seine River, pulling off from the lower right-hand corner towards the upper left, and the banks, of course, reinforce that. There are some vertical lines represented by those trees that are in the towards the upper left-hand corner, and there is a focal point, which is the sun, but none of those things pull towards each other. It's very disjointed structurally. Moreover, everything is blurred. There are no clear outlines. There's not a clear sense of rhythm in the painting. It's simply an impression of a sunrise, this moment that's being celebrated. Those blurry outlines, and with them the celebration of color more than line and structure, becomes translated into the genres of music. So musical impressionism, and this is on the next slide, by the way, works through the same whole tone scales that we talked about, the same pentatonic scales we talked about, the same octatonic scales that we talked about. It also celebrates musical color. When you listen to the Debussy excerpt that is assigned for today, pay attention to how delicately scored it is, how very few instruments play at any given time, and how you end up with beautiful new kind of gentle musical timbres or orchestral timbres that result from all of this. There's another thing that you need to know about musical impressionism, and that is to say that in keeping with this move towards emancipating musical expressionism or expression by celebrating things that previously have been shied away from, we start being not shy at all about dissonances. Take out your score to Nuage from the 3 orchestral nocturnes and follow along with the chords that happen in those opening measures. You can do this throughout the piece, but we'll just take the first few bars. What you see there are streams of 7th, 9th, and 11th chords that, by definition, are dissonant in traditional understandings of harmony. But the way that this piece is scored, they don't sound dissonant. They sound very delicate, very mild, very easy to understand. Right? Moreover, those dissonances do not resolve. One 9th chord is followed by another 9th chord that has no functional relationship to it. It's just a stream of chords. This is what we call chord streaming, and this becomes a particular technique of musical impressionism. So as you are listening to the Debussy piece that we have today, I want you to pay attention to this chord streaming, to the dissonances, and to the very delicate timbres that Debussy uses. This creates the sense of this entire piece as being an impression of cloud. Whoa, cool, look at that. There's some guy in an auditorium at a podium lecturing, and I'm on the screen. How cool is that? Anyway, okay, so that's what we have for today. We have been in France, but these movements that we have looked at today, first of all, the rise of French academicism and the French avant-garde, It's the subsets of the avant-garde being Les Six and the Apaches, followed by Impressionism with composers including uh, Satie, Boulanger, and Debussy. All of those things say that the way that the musical world has operated until this point has become something that is no longer authentic to us. We don't want to sound like this. We don't want to subscribe to those musical values. We want to speak in a fashion that is authentic to ourselves. Here are some techniques that we as composers can employ when we are trying to achieve that, to make our music sound differently for our new age in the early 20th century than any music has ever sounded before. When you listen to these pieces of music, you will hear that, and I encourage you to appreciate the novelty, the innovation that produced these sounds. These sounds are now long since established. They are imitated by countless composers, including, of course, John Williams, but they are sounds that have redefined the musical language of the 20th century, including, most importantly, as a transition to my next presentation, the emancipation of dissonance. Dissonance no longer has to resolve to consonants, and the imperative here is for a composer to express her or himself in whatever fashion he or she wants, regardless of whether or not performers and audiences want that to happen. Okay, so thank you guys for being here. I hope you're all doing well, staying safe. I miss you. I have some fun doing these video lectures, but I really wish I could see you and talk with you in class. I'll see you on the other side. Take care.